Actually, that's a really good question. I didn't talk at all about avionics.
What is the question?
Yeah, the question was, the pilots have a way of measuring their power output and their RPM. I've cut this presentation down a lot, so I lost my slides on the avionics. So my phone is actually the display and CPU of our avionics system. What we do is we have, and I also failed to mention that, I kind of obliquely mentioned that the plane is controlled with radio control. So we have a radio control radio that's mounted sort of on the frame in between the pilot's legs. That goes to a larger joystick that we've soldered in. And then at the very back of the tail, we've got a receiver and a battery and 2 servos. And in that same box with the RC system is an Arduino computer with a Bluetooth transceiver, and we have a airspeed, two different things for getting airspeed. We have an ultrasonic altimeter that's at the very bottom that tells the height, and then we have a power meter in the cranks, and we also have a backup power meter on the pedals. And the power meter in the crank also measures, we have a heart rate meter on the pilot, so it measures RPM, power, and then the heart rate meter tells the heart rate. So all of those different sensors all get fed in through the Arduino, through Bluetooth, and get recorded on the phone. And then the phone actually has a little avionics display showing your altitude and airspeed and stuff like that. We haven't found a very good position for the phone because the fuselage is really crowded and it's sort of stuck behind this frame. You're kind of having to look at it. And I don't think any single pilot that's flown this so far has looked for a fraction of a second at this screen. And because I knew that would probably happen, we also have some audio stuff in there where it'll actually tell you if you can set a desired lowest altitude and highest altitude, and if you're too high or too low, it'll talk to you. It'll actually say too low or too high or too fast or too slow. But none of that, in these short flights that we've done, none of that has really taken effect yet. I think as we start doing longer flights at Moffett over 2 kilometers, the person's going to finally have time to glance over at it. We're going to find a better position in the fuselage so it's easier to see. And we'll probably make some adjustments to it. If we go for a record and we have a course with waypoints plotted out, we're probably going to want to have a screen where they can actually see if they need to turn right or turn left to stay on the waypoints and everything. But yeah, back to the power question. Sorry for this long answer, but it's stuff I forgot to talk about before. It looks like the power was around, 30 or 50 watts higher than the predicted power for each pilot's weight. But we found that the atmospheric conditions we had in February out at Half Moon Bay, we had tons of dew on the plane. And so that both adds weight. Remember, every kilogram adds about 3.5 watts of power. And then it also totally screws up the laminar flow on the airfoil. So we think that if, now that it's more like summer, we're hoping that a lot of that extra drag we didn't expect is going to just go away because we don't have dew on the airplane anymore. Some of it may be some parasite drag elements like the wing mount and stuff that we haven't properly fared yet. But they do have a power meter and they do have a heart rate meter, and they can look at that data themselves and see whether they're performing up to spec. Another question back there?
Is the lift on the horizontal stabilizer negative or neutral?
The question is the lift on the horizontal stabilizer negative or neutral? I think it is slightly negative, but I can't remember for sure. Some people, there's a big debate. Do you want to have positive or negative lift? And really the most efficient is having as close to neutral as you can. One thing I was really worried about on the horizontal stabilizer is it's got a spar that's like 19 millimeters in diameter, and it's pretty long. And so it's really floppy. And you may have noticed in those videos it kind of flops up and down a little bit as it's going positive and negative and you're controlling it. But it actually worked. I mean, I went as far as ordering a thicker spar, and I was going to use a whole different airfoil and make another horizontal tail surface just in case this one is too weak. But so far it's worked out okay. Yes?
Center gravity is the thing for the side of power?
Center of gravity what?
Is it big enough to adjust for different size pilots?
Yeah, so we have an adjustment on the seat, and it turns out that lighter people are shorter typically, and so they end up moving forward, and so that actually is pretty favorable in terms of it adjusts the CG in the right direction, but it doesn't stay in exactly the same place. The dynamics of these airplanes are so slow that it's pretty favorable. You know, you can fly this even if it's negatively statically stable. The Gossamer Condor was totally negatively statically stable, but they were able to fly it no problem. And so we haven't seen any problem so far. We've had people that are like this tall fly it, and we've had people that are this tall fly it. People that are around 200 pounds, I'm supposed to be about 180, 185, but I've been heavy lately, fly it. And we've had people that are more like 130, 140 pounds fly it. And there just hasn't been any issue with CG causing a problem. One thing that's interesting is that the more power you put out, it tends to actually kind of pitch it up a little bit. So as we do more of these test flights, we have a trim system too, where you can hit trim buttons and just slightly change the trim rather than having to mess around with the stick. But nobody's ever had time to mess with any of the controls. The only control anybody's ever been able to use is just the joystick itself. The flights have just not been long enough to really fully, investigate all this yet. Yep.
So, do you make any adjustments to the gearing or the prop speed or the RPM that the pilot turns?
Yeah, the question is to make any adjustments to the RPM or gearing for the prop. The Daedalus actually had a complex constant speed prop system where they had a Borden cable like on a bicycle going up to the center, and they could change that so that the pilot could basically pick their RPM. But that was one of the things we tried to keep simple. I forgot to mention that DaSH stands for Dead Simple Human Powered Airplane. We tried to simplify it as much as we could to get flying earlier. It still took 5 years. So one of the simplifications was to do a fixed pitch prop. So we lined it up so that the pitch is basically, the gearing is so that the pilot should be pedaling at around 85 to 90 RPM when they're at cruise speed, and then you just pedal harder and faster if you want to climb. It turns out that the pitch is very, very sensitive. So the width of a human hair rotating around on the shaft is enough to change the power output by 7%. And so that first flight that I did, we found out I was pedaling at like 115 RPM, way faster than I wanted to, and it's just because the pitch was just a little bit too shallow. So we paid really careful attention to that the next time, and it kind of makes me wish that we had spent the time to do a constant velocity prop. Yes?
You mentioned one of the planes was trying to work with ground effect. Wouldn't you be in ground effect for 30 meters or more with a wingspan or more? Isn't your whole flight in ground effect?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it brings up something else that I didn't mention yet. He's asking about whether you'd be in ground effect, pretty high up because the wingspan's so long. That's true to a certain extent, and what we don't know yet is how much ground effect is helping or hurting us. One thing that both the Gossamer Albatross people, when they went across the channel, noticed, and then the Daedalus people, when they did testing in the desert near Edwards first, and then when they did their actual flight over the water, is there's this weird, on these really, really low wing loading things. We're in the regime of kind of birds, not normal airplanes. And if there's any kind of wind, there's actually sort of an inverse ground effect. There's some sort of micro turbulence close to the ground that actually makes the drag worse on these airfoils and wings than better. And in the middle of Brian Allen's flight across the English Channel, he was at about, a meter or so above, and was getting tired and was ready to quit about in the middle. And they had this technique for using a fishing pole to grab onto a hook on the front of the thing, and then they would just tow him and he wouldn't have to pedal anymore. And so he had to get higher for them to be able to have a favorable angle to get that thing on. So he pedaled higher, and he pedaled up about 2 or 3 meters, and all of a sudden it got way easier to pedal, and he said, wait, I'm gonna keep going. And so the Daedalus people actually quantified that, like they measured that and found that there really was this weird inverse ground effect. So one thing, now that we have a power meter, this is much more sophisticated than in the 80s when they were doing this, 70s and 80s. One thing I want to do at Moffett is if we, start getting long enough, consistent enough flights, is actually just go at 5 meters for, a quarter of a kilometer, then go down to 4 meters, 3, 2, 1, and see if there really is this inverse ground effect or not. It could be that the ground effect is helping us, and you're right, that if the traditional ground effect was happening, it'd probably be effective up to 10, 15 meters. But everything we've heard so far says that it's actually the opposite, that we want to be higher. The Daedalus flight, they actually did about 50 feet above the water the entire flight. On my spreadsheet, I've got an in-ground effect, out-of-ground effect estimate, and I just ignore the in-ground effect because I just assume that it's not reliable. I always look at the out-of-ground effect number. Yes?
They're refining a Whitcomb winglets. Is that even worth exploring, or something like that?
You're asking about winglets?
Yeah, is it even worth it?
Yeah, so you can either make the wing longer to get lower induced drag, or you could add a winglet. The advantage of a winglet is that it reduces the induced drag some without increasing the bending moment on the wing. We weren't really limited by the bending moment on the wing so much, as I explained. That our limiting thing was the strength of the lift wire, and so it's just easier to, rather than having to properly design a winglet, to always just add more span. So our solution for this was just to keep adding span. We have a 33-meter version of the plane. We can add 3 meters to that to make it 36.3, which is what we flew in February. And then we have an even longer full outer wing section that brings it up to 37 meters, and we can add that thing onto it to make it 40 meters. But we haven't messed around with doing winglets at all. If we were worried about putting extra load on the wing, then we would design a winglet to try to further reduce the induced drag back there.
Okay, 2 questions. Are you going to attempt figure-8 flight for controllability? And 2, it seems like you have everything you need for an autopilot, just maybe some software.
The 2 questions were, are we going to try a figure-8 flight to prove that we have controllability, and are we going to do an autopilot? Because we don't have ailerons, this thing is probably like 3 wingspans of radius in the turn, so it's a really, really big turn. One thing, a couple days ago when I was meeting with the guy at Moffett, was asking him if we could do some practice turns. We know it's controllable because we've very easily been able to get it, when it drifts off, get it back onto the runway. It seems like it has really good control, but we haven't been able to investigate whether, if you're in an actual constant turn, how much extra power do you have to put in, how hard is it to keep the turn stable and constant. And I do want to do those tests. The guys at Moffett want to keep their other runway, 3-2 right, open. And so if they know there's no traffic coming in, it's possible that eventually they may be comfortable enough with our operations that they'll let us do some tests like that, but it's not clear. We may have to wait until we get out to the desert before we can actually do that. It's an interesting question. Do we want to try to recreate the Kramer course just for fun? That's something we might do. I hadn't thought about that. Just give me a second more, I'm going to answer this other question. But we're definitely going to do turns once we get out in the desert. It just takes a lot of room. And Moffett is huge, and even Moffett doesn't, barely has. I don't think we could hook a complete 180 at Moffett. Maybe past the end of the hangars, if we go a little bit past the other runway and then came back, we could. But we wouldn't try to do that until we had lots of practice with like 45-degree turns and stuff like that. The other question, the autopilot, yeah, autopilots are actually allowed to in some of these competitions and record-setting things. And I haven't actually investigated whether, for instance, the absolute distance record, it's allowed, but that's something we can think about. We haven't found that the pilot load is too high on the one hand, but on the other hand, when you're really, I don't know if you guys have done a lot of long bike riding, but once you've been riding for a while, even if you're in shape and everything, your mind just kind of goes blank, and it's definitely, the cognitive load can make your athletic performance go down and vice versa. So it's a good point. It's something we might look into. One other thing to mention about the records is the female records are not very far, and we're pretty confident we can break those, even if we have a hard time getting the weather window and everything for the really, really long 70-plus mile flight. The female record, I think, is like 6.8 kilometers and under 30 minutes for duration. So that's probably the first record we'll try to break are those. We've got several really good female athlete pilots that should do pretty well. He had it first.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that you used the analogy of a Coke can. And you said then when you open it, it loses its strength. And I was wondering if you tried pressurizing the main spark. Or thought about that.
Yeah, people ask me that. I think probably because I use that analogy. That would be another valid way of solving that problem. I'm not sure how easy it would be to keep the pressure, to make sure that the whole thing remains sealed, because the material is so thin. But that would be an interesting thing to investigate doing. I think all of these biscuits, everywhere they are, add around a kilogram to the whole plane. So they're I don't know, a couple % of the weight of the whole plane. Sure, if we could pressurize it, it would sure be a lot quicker and easier than putting all these things in, and it took a long time.
Do you have a blog site or a website that announces when you're going to be doing anything?
Yes, I do, and that reminds me that I forgot to bring my cards. I think I may have a few of them in my wallet here, and I probably have more in the car outside if I run out here, so if anybody doesn't get a card here that wants one, I'll rush back to the car as soon as I'm done with Q&A here. Yeah, I do have about maybe 15 of them here. So the blog it's just -pa.blogspot.com. It's on here. And my email address is on here. We have a mailing list that we use to basically announce all the stuff that we're doing and also to get people to volunteer to help. This is an all volunteer effort. So we'd love to have more people help us, do these things throughout. We're planning on basically doing maybe 4 different test weekends at Moffett in the summer and fall. And then if those all go well and we've characterized the power output required and it looks good, then we'll go to the desert starting in late fall, early winter, and try to actually start setting some records. So we'd love to have more of you guys sign up and volunteer.
What desert? Blackrock?
Yeah, I've looked at Black Rock and in the connecting Smoke Creek, I think it's called, desert. And I've also looked at Death Valley. The problem with Black Rock is it's almost 4,000 feet. So you have about 15 watts more of power required because the airplane isn't as efficient, and the athletic performance of the pilot goes down. So that might present some issues. Death Valley is great because it's at sea level. So, and it's got the potential for almost 100 miles at relatively constant altitude. So it might be Death Valley where we do it. At Death Valley, people think, oh no, that would be horrible, but it actually turns out that both the wind and the temperature are really great in December and January. It's like around 60 degrees and the wind is, 0 or a little bit of a tailwind, so perfect. You had a question over here? No, I answered the question. Any more questions? All right, we're done.